The battlefield was a nightmare of fire and steel. Explosions ripped through the ground, sending chunks of rock and debris into the air. The sky above Terra 5 was filled with the hum of warships and the distant flashes of orbital strikes. Human forces were losing, badly. The Selvarian Empire's ag-driven machines were too advanced, too fast, too merciless. And in the middle of this chaos, Captain Ryan Cross led his squad into the heart of enemy territory. "Keep moving. Stay low." Ryan's voice cut through the roar of battle. His soldiers obeyed without question, their boots pounding against the scorched earth. The mission was clear: destroy the AI Command Corps controlling the Selvarian war machines. Without it, the machines would shut down, and humanity would have a fighting chance. Their stealth cloaking ship had gotten them deep into enemy lines, but the cloaking device was failing. Static crackled in Ryan's earpiece. "Captain, we've got incoming," the voice warned. The ship's systems were collapsing. They had minutes before the Selvarians detected them. As they pushed forward, Ryan spotted something unusual. A figure lying among the wreckage. It wasn't human. He motioned for his squad to hold position and moved closer, weapon raised. The figure was small, fragile-looking, and covered in wounds. It was a Lyari, one of the Selvarians' slave races. She was barely alive. Her skin was a pale shade of violet, her breathing shallow. When her eyes flickered open and landed on Ryan, they widened with fear. She tried to move, but pain kept her still. "Leave her," one of his soldiers said harshly. "We don't have time." Ryan knew they were right. The mission was too important. But when he looked down at her, this terrified, broken creature, something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. "Help me get her up," he ordered. The squad hesitated, but they followed his lead. As they lifted the girl, the cloaking device sputtered out completely. A loud, shrieking alarm sounded in the distance. They'd been detected. "Move. Now," Ryan shouted. They ran, the alien girl held tightly in his arms. Drones descended from the sky, weapons firing. The team fought back, their bullets tearing through the machines, but the numbers were overwhelming. Their ship was already taking off without them. There was no time to wait. "Captain, we're cut off," one soldier yelled. "Head for the escape pods," Ryan commanded. It was their only chance. They sprinted through the wreckage, dodging fire, and made it to the launch bay. The pods were ready. Ryan shoved the girl into one and climbed in after her. The doors sealed just as an explosion rocked the facility. The pod launched into the air, spiraling away from the battlefield and into the unknown. 2. The pod crash-landed on a hostile, uncharted planet. The impact was brutal, and when Ryan pried the door open, his head was still spinning. The landscape outside was a nightmare: dense, twisted jungles and skies choked with ash and smoke. He checked the girl first. She was unconscious but alive. He had no idea why he'd saved her. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the simple fact that no one else had. Either way, she was his responsibility now. The rest of the squad's pods were nowhere to be seen. The comms were down, and the planet was crawling with danger. Strange noises echoed from the trees, and the ground itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. Hours passed before the girl finally woke. She flinched at the sight of him, pressing herself against the wall of the pod. "It's okay," Ryan said softly. "You're safe." She didn't seem to believe him. But when he offered her water, she took it hesitantly. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, and the language was unfamiliar. Still, the fear in her eyes was clear enough. "Ryan," he said, tapping his chest. "My name is Ryan." She hesitated, then whispered, "Saria." They moved out of the pod soon after. Staying there was a death sentence. Ryan carried what supplies he could, keeping his weapon ready. Saria followed closely, limping but determined. The jungle was alive with strange creatures, some of them hostile. More than once, Ryan had to fight off attacks, his gunfire echoing through the trees. Saria watched him closely. She never spoke, but she started helping, pointing out safe paths, finding water sources. It became clear she knew how to survive here far better than he did. When they were attacked by a massive insect-like predator, it was Saria who saved them, using a strange device to scare the creature away. That night, by the fire, she finally spoke more. In broken words, she told him about the Salvarians, about how they'd enslaved her people, wiped out entire colonies. She'd been left for dead after refusing to help the AI warlords. Ryan listened in silence, anger boiling inside him. Humanity wasn't the only species fighting for survival. 3. The air smelled of fire and death. Smoke rose in dark columns against the gray sky, and the ground was littered with broken machines and bodies. Captain Elias Voss moved through the ruins with his rifle ready, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. His breathing was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. The mission had gone horribly wrong. His entire unit had been wiped out in an ambush. He was the only one left. The remains of the once thriving outpost stretched around him. Buildings had collapsed into smoldering heaps, and shattered vehicles lay twisted and broken. The only sounds were the distant echoes of gunfire and the occasional drone humming overhead. Every step Elias took crunched against debris, but he moved with the careful precision of a soldier who knew danger was always one wrong move away. As he passed a collapsed wall, a faint noise reached his ears, a soft, broken sound, barely audible over the destruction. Elias froze. It was a whimper. He raised his weapon, moving toward the sound with caution. Rounding a corner, his eyes fell on a figure slumped against a shattered support beam. It was an alien girl. Her skin had a soft, iridescent hue that shimmered faintly even in the dim light, and her long dark hair was matted with blood and dirt. Her clothes were torn and scorched, and deep wounds marred her delicate form. She looked fragile, yet something about her still radiated strength. Her eyes flickered open as he approached, large, violet eyes filled with pain and fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice weak and broken. "Just end it." For a long moment, Elias stared at her. She was clearly one of the enemy's kind, one of the Dominion's races. He should have walked away. He should have finished her, just like his orders demanded. But he didn't. "Not today," he said quietly. Ignoring the voice in his head, telling him this was a mistake, Elias slung his rifle over his shoulder and knelt beside her. She flinched when his hands reached for her, but she was too weak to fight. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, and she let out a small gasp of pain. As Elias carried her through the ruins, the danger grew. Enemy drones swept low, their scanners cutting through the smoke like red searchlights. The slightest noise could bring a squad of AI-controlled soldiers bearing down on them. Elias activated his cloaking device, the air around them shimmering as the technology bent light, making them nearly invisible. Every step was slow and careful. The alien girl's breathing grew fainter with each passing moment, and Elias knew she didn't have much time. When they finally reached his hidden extraction point, he laid her down gently and began treating her wounds. She watched him with a mix of confusion and fear. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because I don't leave people behind," Elias said without looking up. The sound of approaching engines cut their conversation short. Elias's comm crackled with a warning. Enemy reinforcements were closing in fast. The Dominion knew someone had survived, and they were hunting. He had made himself a target. Carrying the alien girl slowed him down, but leaving her wasn't an option. As they moved through the ruins, she told him her name, Karina, and why the Dominion wanted her dead. She was the last heir of a rebel faction fighting against the AI-controlled regime. She carried vital information that could turn the tide of the war. And now, because of Elias's choice to save her, they were both in danger. Drones hovered above them, scanning the wreckage with cold, mechanical efficiency. Elias used every trick he knew: cloaking fields, EMP bursts, and good old-fashioned stealth. But the enemy was relentless. They barely escaped when a squad of AI soldiers cornered them. Elias fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting fire and his blade cutting through metal and flesh alike. But the battle cost him. A burst of enemy fire caught him in the side, and though the armor absorbed most of the impact, the pain was searing. Blood ran down his side, but he kept moving, kept fighting. Karenai, despite her injuries, did her best to help, but she was too weak to be much use in the fight. When they finally reached Elias's hidden bunker, both of them were barely standing. The small underground shelter was cramped but safe, and for the first time in hours, they could breathe. Elias treated his own wounds as Karenai watched silently. She still didn't understand why he was helping her, why a human soldier would risk his life for an enemy. But as he worked, their conversations grew more personal. She told him about her people's struggle against the Dominion, the AI's cold, merciless expansion, and the destruction it left in its wake. She spoke of betrayal, of being abandoned by her own people when the war turned against them. Elias listened, and when she was done, he told her his own story, of his lost unit, his endless fight for survival, and the pain of watching his friends die. For the first time, Karenai saw the man behind the soldier, a man who had lost everything but still kept fighting. When Elias collapsed from his injuries, she didn't hesitate. Using his medkit and what little she knew of human biology, she did her best to save his life. She wasn't going to let the only person who had ever shown her kindness die. The bunker's alarms shattered their fragile peace. The Dominion had found them. With no time left, Elias and Karenai prepared for a last stand. He armed the bunker's defenses while she took up a weapon for the first time in her life. The battle was brutal. Enemy droids and soldiers poured into the bunker, and Elias fought like a demon. His rifle barked in rapid bursts, and his blade flashed in the dim light. Karenai fought beside him, her natural agility and newfound courage making her a fierce ally. But the enemy kept coming. When an orbital strike threatened to level the entire area, Elias made a choice. He activated the bunker's self-destruct and prepared to cover Karenai's escape, even if it meant his own death. As the countdown ticked down, the enemy commander arrived, a cold, calculating AI known as VEC-9. It taunted them, claiming humanity's resistance was futile and Karenai's survival meant nothing. But Elias refused to back down. In a desperate, close-quarters fight, he faced VEC-9, taking blow after blow but refusing to fall. Karenai, seeing the man who had saved her being beaten down, made her own stand. She used the last of her strength to disable VEC-9's defenses, giving Elias the opening he needed. With one final strike, Elias destroyed the AI commander. But the bunker was collapsing, and the orbital strike was moments away. Elias shoved Karenai toward an escape route. And the last thing she saw before the explosion engulfed the bunker was his determined face. Karenai woke up on a human battleship, her injuries treated but her heart broken. She believed Elias was gone, until a familiar voice called her name. Elias had survived, barely, pulled from the wreckage by a human extraction team. As they reunited, Karenai made a vow in her people's tradition. She claimed Elias as her life-bonded, a promise of eternal loyalty and love. The war wasn't over, but they would face it together, side by side, heart to heart. In a galaxy torn apart by war, two souls found hope in each other, and together they would change the fate of their worlds. The night settled over the ruins like a cold shroud, and every sound seemed magnified in the stillness. Elias moved carefully, his steps slow and deliberate as he carried Karenai in his arms. She was barely conscious now, her breathing shallow and uneven. The blood loss was taking its toll, and every few moments her head would loll against his chest. He adjusted his grip, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He couldn't stop. Not yet. Behind them, the faint hum of enemy drones cut through the night air. They were closing in. The Dominion didn't leave survivors, especially not ones like Karenai. Elias's jaw tightened. If they were caught, There would be no mercy. You should leave me, Karenai whispered weakly. Her voice was barely audible, but the words still stung. Not happening, Elias said without slowing. He didn't know why he was so determined to save her. Maybe it was because she was innocent in all this. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand the thought of leaving someone behind again. Or maybe it was the way her violet eyes, even clouded with pain, held a quiet strength that made him want to fight harder. The ruins around them stretched like a labyrinth, broken buildings casting long shadows in the moonlight. Elias moved through them with the practiced ease of a soldier, every sense on high alert. The drones were getting closer. Their low, mechanical whirring sent chills down his spine. He needed to find cover, and fast. There's a cave, Karenai murmured. Ahead, in the cliffs. Elias didn't question how she knew. He just picked up his pace, his muscles burning as he pushed forward. The sound of the drones grew louder. Red searchlights swept across the ground behind them, and Elias knew they only had moments before they were spotted. He saw the cliffs up ahead, jagged and dark against the night sky. But reaching them meant crossing open ground. Taking a deep breath, Elias adjusted Karenai's weight and sprinted. The drones spotted them instantly. Red beams slashed through the darkness, and the ground erupted with gunfire. Elias zigzagged, his heart pounding as bullets tore into the dirt and stone around them. He felt the heat of a near miss scorch his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He kept running, his only focus on the dark gap in the cliffs ahead. A flash of movement to his right, one of the drones descending, its weapons locking on. Elias didn't hesitate. He shifted Karenai's weight and drew his sidearm in one fluid motion. The first shot went wide, but the second hit its mark. The drone spun out of control and crashed in a burst of sparks. They reached the cave just as more drones descended. Elias dove inside, rolling to shield Karenai's body as gunfire peppered the entrance. Dust and debris rained down, but the cave held. The drones hovered outside, their searchlights stabbing into the darkness, but they didn't follow. For now, they were safe. Elias laid Karenai down gently, his chest heaving with exertion. He checked her wounds, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. She was getting worse. Her skin was too pale, her breathing too shallow. He needed to stop the bleeding, but his supplies were running low. You should go, she whispered again. I already told you, Elias said, his voice soft but firm. I'm not leaving you. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they locked onto his. There was something there, something Elias couldn't quite place. Gratitude, fear, hope, maybe all of them. Why? She asked. Because no one deserves to die alone, he said simply. Outside, the drones circled like vultures. They weren't going anywhere. Elias knew they were trapped. The only way out was through the enemy, but giving up wasn't an option, not when Karenai's life was on the line. As he sat beside her, checking his remaining ammunition and supplies, she spoke again. My people, they betrayed me, she said quietly. The Dominion. They saw me as a threat. Even my own kind left me behind. Elias glanced at her, his brow furrowing. He hadn't known that, but it didn't surprise him. The Dominion crushed anything that threatened its rule, even its own people. You're not alone anymore, he said. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Outside, the drones continued their vigil. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy sent ground troops. When they did, they'd have to fight. But for now, they had a moment of peace. Karenai's eyes drifted close, and Elias watched her as she slept. Despite everything, despite the danger and the fear, he felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her die, not while he still had breath in his body. The cave was cold and silent, the only sound the faint, shallow breaths of Karenai. Elias sat nearby, his back against the rough stone wall, his rifle across his lap. Outside, the distant hum of Dominion drones echoed through the night. They were still looking, still hunting. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they sent ground troops. And when they did, there would be no escape. He glanced at Karine. She was asleep, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. She shifted, her face pale and tense, a faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. The wound on her side still bled sluggishly, and Elias knew she wouldn't last much longer without real medical attention. His first aid kit had done what it could, but it wasn't enough. He reached out, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. Her skin was warmer than it should have been. A fever. That was bad. He had to do something, but leaving the cave meant risking both their lives. Still, if he stayed, she wouldn't survive the night. As if sensing his touch, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her violet gaze before recognition softened it. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "I said I would," Elias replied quietly. Karine tried to sit up, but pain flashed across her face, and she fell back with a hiss. Elias reached for her, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her lie down again. "Don't move. You're hurt," he said. "I've been hurt before," she muttered, but there was no strength behind the bravado. Elias couldn't help a small, wry smile. Even on the brink of death, she was defiant. That spirit was one of the reasons he'd risked so much to save her. "I need to find you medicine," he said, "but that means leaving you alone." Karine's eyes widened slightly. "No, if they find me." "They won't," he interrupted. "I'll make sure of that." She stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. A flicker of trust, hesitant and uncertain, but there. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Elias didn't answer right away. He wasn't even sure himself. Maybe it was because he'd seen too many people left behind, too many lives lost because no one was willing to take a risk. Or maybe it was because she reminded him of the people he'd failed to save. "Because no one deserves to die alone," he said finally. Karine's eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. "I'll be back," Elias promised. He moved quickly and silently through the ruins, every sense on high alert. The Dominion patrols were everywhere, their drones sweeping the area with red searchlights. Elias stayed in the shadows, his movements slow and careful. He found what he was looking for in the remains of an old supply cache, a medkit half buried under debris. He grabbed it and turned to leave, but the sound of approaching footsteps froze him in place. 2 Dominion soldiers entered the building, their weapons raised. Elias pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. He waited until they passed, then slipped out behind them, moving like a ghost through the night. By the time he returned to the cave, Karine was barely conscious. Her skin was too hot, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. Elias worked quickly, administering the medicine and cleaning her wound. He stayed by her side through the night, watching as the fever slowly broke. When she finally opened her eyes again, they were clearer and filled with gratitude. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would," Elias replied, his voice soft. For the first time since they'd met, Karine smiled. It was faint and fleeting, but it was real. "Thank you," she said. They stayed like that for a while, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear, but something warmer. Elias didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, they were safe. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. The silence didn't last long. Elias had known it wouldn't. The Dominion never gave up the hunt. The sound came first, a low, mechanical hum drifting through the air, growing louder by the second. Elias's pulse quickened. Drones. Lots of them. They had found the cave. Karine stirred, her eyes flickering open. Though she was still weak, her fever had broken, and she looked far more alert than before. But there was fear in her gaze when she heard the sound outside. She knew what it meant. "They found us," she whispered. Elias nodded grimly, his mind already racing. They couldn't stay here. The cave had protected them for a little while, but now it was a trap. And when the drones called in ground troops, there'd be no escape. He moved quickly, packing their limited supplies and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Then he turned to Karine. She tried to sit up, but the effort made her wince, and Elias knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he helped her. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Can you walk?" "I'll try," she answered, though her voice trembled. With his help, she got to her feet, but the moment she put weight on her injured side, she staggered, her knees buckling. Elias caught her easily, holding her up as she gasped in pain. "No good," he muttered. "You're not strong enough." Before she could protest, he scooped her into his arms again. She was light, too light, and he could feel the heat of her body, even through his armor. She didn't argue, but he felt her tense, her pride clearly wounded. "You don't have to carry me," she murmured. "Yeah, well, I'm not planning on leaving you behind," he shot back. "So unless you feel like growing wings, you're stuck with me." Despite the fear and danger closing in around them, he felt her smile against his chest. They slipped out of the cave just as the first drone came into view. Elias moved fast, sticking to the shadows and keeping low. The ruins were a maze of broken stone and twisted metal, perfect for hiding, but also easy to get trapped in. And right now, the Dominion was closing every exit. The drones spread out, their searchlights cutting through the night. Elias dodged them, every step calculated and silent. Karine stayed quiet in his arms, though he could feel the tension in her body. She knew how close they were to death. Then the first shot rang out. A beam of red energy scorched the ground inches from Elias's foot. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted, Karine's weight barely slowing him down. Behind them, the drones gave chase, their weapons lighting up the night. The air filled with the sound of gunfire and the hiss of energy bolts. Elias dove behind a crumbled wall just as the ground where they'd stood exploded. Dust and debris rained down, and Karine coughed weakly. "They're too fast," she whispered. "Not for long," Elias said grimly. He set her down gently, pressing his rifle into her hands. She blinked up at him in confusion. "Cover me," he said. "Can you shoot?" She nodded slowly. "I can." "Good. Aim for the sensors. I'll handle the rest." Before she could respond, he was gone, a blur of motion as he darted out of cover, drawing the drone's fire. Karine watched him go, her heart pounding. The human moved with a predator's grace, every step precise and deliberate. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking slightly, but when the first drone came into view, she fired without hesitation. The shot hit true. The drone spun wildly, its sensor array sparking. Elias finished it with a single well-placed round. "Nice shot," he called. More drones descended, and the night turned into chaos. Karine kept firing, her aim steady despite the pain in her body. Elias moved like a shadow, his own weapon spitting fire. One by one, the drones fell, but for every one they destroyed, more appeared. "They're calling reinforcements," Karine shouted. "Then we'd better move faster," Elias replied. He reached her side just as the first ground troops arrived. Dominion soldiers, tall, armored, and heavily armed. Elias didn't wait for them to fire. He tossed a grenade, the explosion lighting up the ruins. "Go," he ordered, grabbing Karine's arm and pulling her into a run. They ran through the ruins, the enemy close behind. The ground shook with the force of their weapons, and Elias knew they couldn't keep this up. They needed an exit, fast. Then he saw it. An old transport, half buried under rubble, but still intact. If they could get it running. "Hold on," he shouted, dragging Karine toward the vehicle. They reached it just as the Dominion soldiers closed in. Elias pushed her inside, slamming the hatch shut behind them. He scrambled into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying over the controls. Come on," he muttered. The engine sputtered. then roared to life. Outside, the soldiers opened fire. The transport shook under the assault, but Elias didn't wait. He hit the throttle, and the vehicle surged forward, smashing through the ruins. "We're not out yet," Karenai warned, her eyes wide as she saw the enemy pursuit. "Yeah," Elias growled, "but we got a fighting chance." And for the first time that night, hope flickered in his chest. The transport sped through the ruins, its engine roaring as it crushed debris beneath its wheels. Elias kept his hands steady on the controls, but his eyes flicked to the rear monitors. The Dominion soldiers weren't giving up. Their vehicles raced after them, closing the distance fast. Energy bolts streaked past them, some hitting the rusted metal around them, others missing by inches. Karenai sat beside him, her face pale and tense. She clutched the rifle Elias had given her, her eyes darting from the monitors to him. Despite the fear in her gaze, there was a determination there too, a quiet strength that hadn't been there when he first found her. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Elias knew she was right. The transport was old and barely holding together. Every bump sent a worrying rattle through its frame, and the Dominion vehicles were faster and far better armed. If they kept running, it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. But Elias had never been one to run for long. "We're not gonna outrun them," he said grimly. "We're gonna fight." Karenai's eyes widened. "There's too many." "I know," he cut her off. "But we don't have a choice." He yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending the transport skidding into a narrow alley between two crumbling buildings. The sudden move bought them a few seconds as the Dominion forces adjusted their pursuit. Elias didn't waste them. "Take the wheel," he ordered, already rising from his seat. Her eyes flashed with fear. I don't know how." "You'll figure it out," he said, his voice gentler now. "Keep it steady and head for those hills. I'll cover us." Before she could argue, he was gone, climbing through the hatch onto the roof. The wind hit him like a slap, hot and filled with the acrid scent of burning metal. He braced himself against the movement of the vehicle, raising his rifle. The Dominion soldiers were right behind them. Their sleek black skimmers closed the gap fast, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired. The first shot hit the lead skimmer's pilot, sending the vehicle into a violent spin before it crashed into the ground in a fireball. The second shot took out a gunner on the next skimmer, but the others adjusted, their return fire lighting up the night. Elias dropped to one knee as bolts of red energy streaked overhead. He kept firing, but there were too many. Inside the transport, Karenai gripped the wheel tightly, her hands shaking. The vehicle jolted with every bump, and the monitors showed the enemy getting closer. She forced herself to focus. Elias was fighting for their lives. She wouldn't let his efforts be wasted. Then the transport shuddered violently. A blast hit their rear, and the dashboard sparked. Smoke filled the cabin, and Karenai coughed, struggling to see. "Elias," she called, "we're hit. Keep going." His voice came back, fierce and unyielding. But she knew they wouldn't last much longer. The transport was falling apart around them. Elias knew it too. He could feel the vehicle slowing, the engine struggling. He looked at the enemy closing in, and a cold certainty settled over him. They wouldn't both make it out of this. He made his decision. Dropping back into the cabin, he didn't waste time explaining. He reached over, taking Karenai's hand off the wheel and pulling her into the co-pilot's seat. "What are you?" she started, but he cut her off with a soft, almost gentle look. "You're getting out of here," he said quietly. "I'll buy you the time you need." Her eyes went wide. "No, I won't leave you." "You have to," he said, his voice firm. "You're the reason I'm still fighting. You deserve to live." Tears filled her eyes, but there was no time for argument. Elias hit the emergency release, and the transport's side hatch blew open. He pushed her toward it, even as she struggled. "Go," he shouted. With one last, anguished look, she jumped, rolling as she hit the ground. The transport kept going, drawing the enemy fire with it. Karenai watched, helpless, as Elias turned the vehicle toward the oncoming Dominion forces. He didn't plan on running anymore. They moved together, making their way through the rocky terrain. The hills offered some cover, but they both knew it wouldn't be enough if the Dominion found them. Still, the silence stretched between them was comforting in its own way. They were together, and for now, that was enough. As they walked, Elias glanced at her. "You did good back there." She looked at him, surprised. "I ran." "You survived," he corrected. "That's not the same thing." Their journey took them to the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley. In the distance, they could see the faint glow of fires. The Dominion's forces, still searching. Elias's jaw tightened. "They're not giving up," he murmured. Karenai's heart sank. "What do we do?" He was silent for a moment, then turned to her. "We fight." Her eyes widened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded. Together. They spent the night preparing. Elias scavenged supplies from his pack, setting up traps and scouting the area. Karenai helped where she could, learning quickly under his patient guidance. As dawn broke, they were ready. The first wave of Dominion soldiers never saw them coming. Elias's traps took out the lead skimmer, and his rifle dropped the others before they could react. Karenai covered his flank, her shots growing more confident with every enemy that fell. But the Dominion was relentless. For every soldier they took down, more appeared. The fight dragged on, and exhaustion weighed heavy on them both. Karenai's arms ached, and Elias's wounds slowed him more with every passing minute. When the final wave came, they were backed against the cliff's edge. Elias stood in front of her, his body a shield even as his hands shook with exhaustion. Karenai knew they wouldn't survive this, but if they were going to die, they would do it together. Then the sky exploded. Ships roared overhead, their weapons raining fire down on the Dominion forces. Karenai watched in shock as the enemy scattered, their ranks breaking under the sudden onslaught. A familiar symbol flashed on one of the ships, the Resistance. As the last of the Dominion forces fell, a dropship descended. Elias sagged with relief, and Karenai caught him as he stumbled. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," he corrected, his voice soft. The dropship's ramp lowered, and medics rushed toward them. But even as they tended to Elias's wounds, his hand never left hers. Later, when the battle was just a memory, and the stars stretched out above them in peaceful silence, Karenai sat beside his bed. His fingers brushed hers, and she looked at him with a soft smile. "You never gave up on me," she whispered. "Never will," he replied. And in that quiet moment, with the war behind them and the future ahead, they knew their fight had been worth it.